Everyone and their mom is hating on the Minnesota fighting Vikings. Now, mainly it is national fans. It is national media jabroni haircuts. It's some Vikings fans. I don't know. But we're getting some real tea in this report from Jason Cole, who's been a longtime NFL writer, votes for the Hall of Fame, all that stuff, over at Outkick. Minnesota Vikings to win Super Bowl. One GM's twisted answer says it might very well happen. So now you're thinking it might be a fluff piece, but no. Here we go. The Vikings are total frauds. That's how a frustrated NFL general manager of a team that lost to Minnesota earlier this season put it this week as he went through a tedious discussion about the NFC's number 2 seed in the NFL playoff picture. We'll get to an investigation here in a second. But here's what the anonymous GM of a team that lost to the Vikings earlier in the season said. That's a team that should be 500 at best. They have 2 players who you have to account for, Jefferson and Dalvin Cook. The GM explained in part of a rant that got increasingly testy as he thought about it. They're so lucky how things have fallen into place. The GM then took a moment to control his anger, which he admitted is attached to losing to the Vikings this season. As he took a few seconds to think about it, he made another strange admission. They might very well win the Super Bowl, the GM said. That's how bizarre this season has been. So now, reverse engineering. So he talked about the GM, how the GM got angry and bitter about how they lost to the Vikings. So you're thinking it's probably a close game, but of course the Vikings have only played close games. So we have the Vikings record this season, score of the games, as well as the GM of the respective teams. So now let's do a little analysis, right? So Packers, probably not Gutekunst, seems pretty even keeled. Plus, I mean, the Packers aren't going anywhere this year. Whatever. So they said it was a GM that they lost to. I mean, Brad Holmes, I don't know. Like, I don't really know anything about Brad Holmes. It doesn't really have a reputation for being a hothead, a guy who gets angry. But, I mean, the way that the Lions lost to the Vikings, blowing 2 double-digit leads, Dan Campbell really screwed things up at the end, first time around. And instead of splitting with the Vikings, they could have swept the season series, been 8-6, and firmly been in the wild card race. I mean, maybe. We'll give Brad Holmes a maybe. Mickey Loomis, no. Oh, actually, maybe? I don't know. Poles seems to be the most likely scenario here, especially the way that the Bears came roaring back, and then was snatched away at the end. But I don't know. Like, he seems bitter. Like the GM... Again, this reads like the GM is bitter because it's costing them potentially a playoff spot or something like that. But so I don't know if Poles would fall into that category. Chris Greer and the Dolphins. I don't know. Chris Greer doesn't seem like a guy who would get angry either. I mean, plus the Dolphins have other issues right now. Steve Keim, maybe, even though Arizona obviously isn't competing at all. Martin Mayhew. I mean, the Commies, probably not. Maybe Brandon Beane. That doesn't make a lot of sense, though, because the Bills are still the 1 seed in the AFC. But maybe they're still just bitter about that loss and how the Vikings came all the way back, 17 points. Maybe. Belichick, obviously not. Joe Douglas, no. I don't know. So I guess my top 3, if I had to guess, would probably be... I still think it might be Poles. I don't know why. We laid out our rationales like, hey, it's probably a team that's in the playoff hunt and probably could have used the game. But just factoring in the way that the Bears lost to the Vikings, and then also, Poles saying that they're coming back to take over the NFC North and they're not giving it back. Maybe. Brad Holmes, maybe. I don't know. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. But it's pretty hilarious. I mean, but remember, Jason Cole has been a long-time writer, so getting a GM to open up about this, even off the record, or not off the record, but even anonymously, it's pretty amazing. Then it goes into the Viking stats. Blah, 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 point differential. 10-0 in games decided by 8 points or less. Cool. They have only won 1 game by double digits, and that was week 1 against the Packers. They have only beaten 3 teams with winning records. Well, yeah, because the teams don't have winning records because the Vikings beat them. So that's a loss instead of a win. They were dominated in 3 losses to Dallas, Philadelphia, and Detroit by a combined score of 98-33. Now, wait a minute. Now, wait. The whole dominated by the Lions, even though the Lions... That was really a 1-score game. I mean, the Lions tacked on a meaningless field goal at the end, but dominated? Nah. No. Now, I will admit the Eagles and the Cowboys games were ass kickings. So there you go. They have come back from deficits of 33, 17, 14 in the second half of games, including the historic win against the Colts on Saturday. Blah, blah, blah. Can the Vikings win the Super Bowl? Still, there are qualities about the Vikings that the GM liked enough to say he could see it lining up as a very weird year. The first thing I asked myself is, can they get to the Super Bowl? The GM said. Given that they got dominated by Philly and Dallas, you tend to think no. I'm sure they could. I'm not even sure they could beat San Francisco. Rude. But that game will probably be in Minnesota at some point, blah, blah, blah. Cowboys, blah, blah, blah. As GM said, he kept toggling between arguing for the Vikings even getting to the Super Bowl and the fact that he doesn't think they are good enough to be in the playoffs. Bitter. B-I-T-T-E-R. As the GM said, blah, blah, blah. The thing is, the AFC teams are going to give up points. Kansas City is no good on defense. Buffalo's more injured than ever. All right, so it's not Brandon Beane. Cincinnati makes great adjustments second half, but they don't scare you. If any of the other teams, the Chargers, the Ravens, or Dolphins get in, they're even worse, the GM said. All right, so it's not Chris Greer, and it's not Brandon Beane. All right, so going back again. All right, so, I mean, is it Brad Holmes or Ryan Poles? That would make sense. I mean, Steve Keim, maybe. The one thing you know is the Vikings can score. I'm not a big fan of quarterback Kirk Cousins, but when you have Jefferson, Cook, and the rest of those offensive players, you create problems. It would be shocking, but not crazy, if that makes sense. And normally that wouldn't make sense in 2022. It somehow does. So, I mean, the GM is super pissed off that his team lost to the Vikings. But I don't know. It does speak to a guy whose team is not in the playoffs, doesn't it? So if it was Brad Holmes, I don't think he would be fluffing up the Vikings as much because the Lions potentially could be in the playoffs. So going back to this, I mean, maybe Mickey Loomis, maybe Ryan Poles, maybe Steve Keim. I don't know, man. But I as much as I'm ripping on this rival GM for being bitter, I don't think that he's wrong. I don't think that a lot of people see the Vikings as completely legit, even though, I mean, 11-3 doesn't happen by accident. It just doesn't. And yeah, the Vikings had a couple bad losses. It sort of is what it is. But I mean, this team just finds a way to get it done in tight spots. Now, point differential. But at the end of the day, one game at a time. If you have a positive point differential, guess what? You win. And that's all that matters. Close out the regular season and into the playoffs. I mean, it's not a best-of-7 series. It is on any given Sunday. Lots of weird stuff could happen. So whether the Vikings are going up against the Lions or the Niners or the Cowboys or the Eagles, it really doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter. One game at a time, and then maybe we'll see them in the Super Bowl. Well, we won't see this team in the Super Bowl. Yeah, we won't see the GM, that bitter GM's team in the Super Bowl, that's for sure. But your thoughts are thoughts. Bitter anonymous GM rips the Vikings, but also sort of praises them. Let us know your thoughts and our thoughts and their thoughts in the comment section below. Subscribe for daily Vikings takes. Want to support the work? Put a little something in the Venmo. But till next time, Skull Production Value.